Glenda, and thanks to all of you. It's really a great pleasure for me to be back in Aspen, because for everybody, you kind of come here and you start to think that anything is possible. There's so many great people, so much potential in so many different categories. So let me ask you a question for this community where we think that everything is possible. How many of you, if you could, would like to live healthy lifestyle, so healthy, mobile, your mind works, your body works, to be 123 years old? If you could have perfect health, how many of you would like to live to 123? Great. Okay, no, some of you don't, and we'll talk about that. So if you want to live to 123, it's great to do all the things that our other speakers have talked about. You have to exercise. You have to not eat croissant, as Jane Nathanson did this morning. And as a matter of fact, she's not here, so I don't know if there's a connection between those things. But all of these lifestyle things you must do, and you're here in Aspen because you believe in doing them, and that's part of being in this community. But to go beyond ourselves and what, at the end of the day, we are these magnificent creatures, but at the end of the day, we are just some monkeys who climbed down from the trees and stood up so we could see predators coming above the grass. So we have this biology. This biology gives us a lot of great opportunities. John Gray was talking this morning about how we can unleash some of that, the capability, but there are limits of the biology that we are born with and that we have inherited and that we have evolved over 4 billion years in our progression from single-cell organisms to us. And I gave a talk yesterday with Carol Lee and Access Circles about the genetics revolution. And the summary, the two-sentence summary of that talk is that we are on the verge of a fundamental revolution in how we think about biology. That Watson and Crick, with identifying the double helix structure of DNA, identified that there was a manual of life. In sequencing DNA, we began a process of learning how to read that manual. And now with gene editing and CRISPR and other tools, we are beginning and have the rudimentary capabilities of writing and rewriting the code of life. And so when you think about what is a technology that's writable and readable and hackable, Gina has it in her hand. No, it's okay, you can keep looking. It is information technology. And what the transformation that we're now undergoing is recognizing that ultimately our biology is, and DNA is, an information technology. And so when we think about biology as information technology, that leads us to this recognition that it is inevitable that we will be hacking and manipulating our biology, or many of us will be hacking and manipulating our biology. And we'll do it for great reasons, because nobody wants to die of the defects in our biology. And whenever anybody dies, at any age, of these terrible diseases, of cancer or cardiovascular disease or whatever, all of these genetic diseases, nobody thinks, oh, that's so wonderful, it's so natural. And nobody really thinks that this is just because that person ate an extra croissant. The reason why we are getting all of these diseases is that we're living longer. And so these diseases, which are diseases, many of them are completely correlated with aging, you didn't get if you lived in the Middle Ages and life expectancy was 30. You didn't get if you were alive at the time of the Roman Empire and average life expectancy was 25. You should be so lucky as to get cancer or dementia or all these kinds of diseases that old people get. And so we are going to remake our biology, and it's going to change everything. I believe, as I was speaking about yesterday, that we are going to speciate, and that we're going to have just different capabilities that different communities or different individuals are going to develop. We're going to have those abilities to change our biology, to develop new capabilities, some that are now outlier human capabilities, or capabilities from the animal kingdom that we're going to be able to bring into our genetic code, or capabilities that don't exist now, but we can imagine because all of life comes from these same building blocks, and that, as we see from the diversity of life on Earth, those building blocks can be arranged in many different ways. So one of the implications of this is that we're going to revolutionize healthcare, and we were speaking a lot about this yesterday. And another one is that we are going, if we choose, to change the way that we age and the traditional notions of our mortality. And that's all going to be coming. And so all of these lifestyle things that we talked about and the blue zones, it's critically important. You must be doing those things. But if you want to get to 123, and the reason I pick 123 is we heard this morning about Jean Calment, who is the longest-lived woman known in history, who died at 122. We think of that as the limit of what's possible with the biology that we have. And it's not surprising that she smoked and drank and whatever, because if you want to live to 90, you should do all these really healthy lifestyle things. If you want to live to 100, make sure you pick the right parents, because this is about our genetics. And if you have the wrong genetics, you can extend it a little bit. You're not going to live to 110 with the wrong genetics. But even so, there have been forever, even before we had all of this technology, in our mythologies, we have always dreamed of immortality. In every tradition, there is the myth of immortality, and whether it's Gilgamesh or Methuselah or the ideas of Soma in Hindu culture. Every culture has this idea of living forever. And it's been a very dangerous idea, because this search for immortality has led to all sorts of wars and murders and all types of terrible things. But then we've had the advent of science. In 1895, there was a major innovation in longevity where a doctor realized that had the idea that if you ground up monkey testicles and injected them into people, people would live longer. It turned out it didn't work. But by 1920, there was another major step forward where somebody took that original research and said, well, don't grind up the monkey testicles, take goat testicles and insert them into the scrotum of men, and then they will live longer. But unfortunately, that didn't work. And so while we were doing all of these things, but if people want to try it, actually there's a clinic, we'll have a table in the back. And we're doing a double-blind study, so you can pick whether you want to get it or just have a placebo shot. It's up to you. But while we were imagining all of these scientific approaches, many of which didn't work, we were steadily advancing longevity. As I mentioned, at the time of the Roman Empire, average life expectancy 25. It didn't budge much. Middle ages 30. Only 100 years ago, or a little more than 100 years ago, average life expectancy in the United States was only 49. And now it's approaching 80. And the reason for that, as you all know, are these things. It's diet, it's sanitation, it's healthcare, all of these things. But now we are bumping up against our own biological limits. We can do better, and I think many of our speakers today have spoken about doing better. But we are bumping up against these natural limits of how long humans are designed in our current formulation in order to live. So if we want to do better, if we want, to push the limits of aging and what's possible and longevity, and it's not longevity itself is not a worthwhile goal, in the sense that if we live longer but don't live healthier longer, we are adding to the global commons of misery. But if we live longer and live healthier longer, we are unlocking a tremendous amount of capability. We were just having a conversation here over lunch, and we were talking about what is a normal and healthy lifespan. And there were two different views at the table. One was we should take all that we can get, and the other was, well, there's a season of life, and we don't want to overstay our welcome. When it's time, it's time. But if you were living in the Roman Empire and somebody died at 30, you wouldn't say, oh my God, that's a tragedy, you were robbed. You would say, well, that's kind of what happens. Stuff happens to a person. But if somebody dies at 30, that's a terrible tragedy, and it is. And what's the difference between people, and again, it's the same biology. We have the same biology as people 2,000 years ago. But what's the difference? What's the contribution that person who died at 25 or 30 would have made had that person lived to 80? So it's my view that so much investment goes into making a human being. When you have all of the growth and all of the learning and all of the experiences and all of the relationships, I think it's a terrible tragedy when somebody dies, even of old age, at any age. And if you could extend healthy life by 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, not only would you we save trillions of dollars in healthcare costs, and as a matter of fact, the average person who dies past 100 has 1/3 the healthcare costs in their last 2 years of life than the average person who dies in their 70s. But we would unleash all of this capability, all these problems that we would be able to solve, all these books and poetry that would be written, all this love that would go around, all this experience that would be able to be brought into our lives. So when we think about how do we get to that point, the first question that we need to ask is, what is aging? And that's actually a more complicated question. I mean, when you're trying to think of disrupting aging, you have to figure out what it is that you're disrupting. And aging, it's not one thing. It's a complex phenomena. And that's why any one intervention probably won't work. It's like a car that you could, if you have an older car, if you fix one thing, it may not save the whole car. But there are ways of thinking about it, and we'll talk about this in a moment. If you're very careful of how the car is used over the lifetime of the car, at least you're going to do a better job of making sure that all of the parts can last a little better. So what is aging? There's still a debate about it, but the consensus is it's a few different things. One is the compounding of errors in the copying of your DNA. So as you know, your cells, almost all of your cells are constantly turning over, and that's what stem cells are doing, are pushing that process forward. But there are errors in that as you get older, you have more and more errors introduced as your cells are dividing. And so those errors accumulate over time. So that's one theory of aging. Another theory is that your stem cells are depleted in that process, so that the stem cells themselves have a life cycle, and when they become less capable of driving that process forward, you age. And a third, and these could all be true in part, is inflammation. And we've heard this morning about chronic inflammation, which grows. There are ways of addressing it, but inflammation increases over the course of life, and that is also something that drives aging forward. So, and when we think about, well, how can we disrupt that, we have to look to various places for models. Where can we learn about how we might approach disrupting and really hacking the aging process? So a logical first place to start is our own evolution. And there are people who say that dying is natural, and dying at whatever age, whether it's 80 or whatever, is natural. But that doesn't mean that evolution has selected it, because a lot of our evolution, at least in this formulation of humans, was still done 2,000 years ago. We're not very different from what we were then. And it kind of makes sense that evolution doesn't really, doesn't really care that much about old people. Because if we were a species where too many of our babies were being eaten by saber-toothed tigers, then we would have developed exoskeletons like other creatures who are unprotected, and then the ones who survive have a thick exoskeleton and they survive. If we were a species where parents were being eaten, we would have developed kids who can survive on their own. Komodo dragons, once they come out of the egg, that's it. If they run into their parents will eat them. So everything that you need to know as a Komodo dragon is built into your genetics. And if you're asking questions, you're kind of screwed. But for us, historically, if a saber-toothed tiger were to eat somebody who is not an infant and not a parent, but a grandparent, it wouldn't have that big of an evolutionary impact on a species. It sucks for that person, and maybe for their friends. And so I believe that evolution hasn't selected one way or another for how long we should live. And I think that's good, because if we were pushing against 4 billion years of evolution, I think that would be a harder thing to do. So we can look to evolution. We can look to human models. We heard about Jean Calment. And again, she had great aging genetics. Her famous quote, she said, was, "I've only had one wrinkle in my life, and I'm sitting on it." We talked about the blue zones, and so that's another way to look at communities that live longer. And then we can also look at, now with the tools of genetic sequencing, we can sequence, and that's what's happening at Albert Einstein and other universities around the world, sequence superagers, the centenarians, people who live a very long time, and compare them to the rest of the population and say, well, what are the genes that these superagers have? And then what are these genes doing? And we'll talk about some of the approaches for addressing aging in a moment. So those are some of the models for humans, but we also can learn a lot from animals. And so one way to do that is comparative biology. And so we can look at animals that are closely related, like a mouse and a naked mole rat, or a regular clam and a quahog clam. And so a mouse can live up to about 4 years, and a naked mole rat, genetically related, can live about 40. Or a regular clam can live about 40, and a quahog clam can live 500, but we don't know how long they can live because they found this clam that was 500 years old, and they said they took it out of the water to inspect how old it was, and it died then. So maybe it could have had a longer time. So we can look at comparative biology and say, well, what are the genetic differences between closely related beings? We can also look at disparities across the animal kingdom. Like bowhead whales are the world's longest lived mammals, and they can live around 200 years. But there's non-mammals, like Greenland sharks, that can live 500 years. And then there are immortal jellyfish that, as far as we know, can live forever. They go from their polyp stage to their mature phase stage, and then back to their polyp stage, and that process can go on forever. And so we can study, well, what's happening in those animals? What's happening that's allowing them to do things like regenerate parts, like some animals can do, like go back to their polyp stage. And again, we once thought of biology as science plus magic. I believe that biology is science, and that we are getting smarter and smarter. We will never be completely smart. We will never have complete understanding of biology. But if we think it's possible to understand a single-cell organism, and we can understand a single-cell organism pretty well, and if we think, as I do, that we are single-cell organisms gone wild, then it would make sense that as our technology becomes better, and as our knowledge becomes deeper, we are going to understand more and more of what makes a human being. And it will not, in my view, it will not be soul and spirit and pixie dust. It will be biology, which is governed by rules that will be understandable. And again, as I said in the beginning, writable, readable, like your thumb. Look how well it works. Writable, readable, and hackable. So we are going to understand more and more by looking at this biology. And then there are very interesting experiments that scientists are doing that are very intuitive. And this is easily done with the C. elegans roundworms, or with fruit flies or flies, is you get a bunch of flies and you put them in a little cage with some food, and then you wait till 98% of them die, and then there'll be 2% left. And then you mate those ones with each other, and then you have more, fruit flies, and do the same, and then you'll only have a couple left. And then you do it again, and you kind of keep doing it. At the end, you will have fruit flies that are living 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times longer than the fruit flies who died in the beginning of the experiment. And then what you do is you sequence these long-lived superagers, and you compare that to the genetics of the ones who died, and you say, well, what are those genes that allowed them to be superagers? And then you can say, well, are there analogs between those genes in the fruit flies and those genes in humans? And then you can understand what is happening. And a lot of that animal research has pointed to something which is in a way very intuitive of why these superagers live longer. And in part, it has to do with the allocation of energy. On a cellular level, our cells are always figuring out how to allocate energy. And the basic directional choices, one is allocating towards growth, which is what you need when you're young and when you're in all kinds of situations, when you're healing, when you need growth, and towards repair. And if you are overgrowing, that means you're kind of at it all the time. It's the car that's going 100 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour all the time, it's going to break down. And if you are in repair mode, you can actually last longer. That's the car that the little old lady drove slowly to work and parked in the garage and changed the oil every 3 months and did all of those other things. And it turns out, we've heard a lot about calorie restriction this morning, that there are parallels on the genetic level for humans, for that figuring out what's the balance between growth, energy towards growth, and energy toward repair. And the reason why intuitively that makes sense is that we are the fruit flies in that experiment. There are a lot of us here now, but there have been 3 times over our recent history, recent meaning hundreds of thousands of years, when humans have been down to a relatively small number, the Homo sapiens, down to 8,000 to 10,000 beings left in the entire world. And it happened 70,000 years ago. It happened 200,000 years ago, where everybody died out for one reason or another, whether it was particulate matter in the air or starvation or whatever, or changes in the climate. And the ones who left were the ones who had a much better ability to go towards that screensaver mode in life, to kind of hunker down and allocate their resources efficiently. And so when you think of why does calorie restriction work, it works because we have this innate survival ability inside of us. And so now there are many different approaches, many different ways of exploring what type of interventions can work to trigger these kinds of responses. One on calorie restriction, because the glucose, how your body is dealing with glucose, is the way that the body uses to allocate that energy to figure out how best to do it. That's why type 2 diabetes drugs like metformin is the most popular, is now showing, there's about to go into human trials, showing not just it helps with type 2 diabetes, but it potentially, and don't go out and take these drugs, but it potentially will have life-extending capabilities and health-extending capabilities that will address multiple diseases and the underlying biology of aging itself. Rapamycin, similar, is an immunosuppressant that people take when you're having an organ donation. It has those same longevity approaches. And then there are a lot of approaches that are looking at exploring rejuvenation. I talked about stem cell depletion as a way of something that ages us. And there's a lot of research going into, well, how can we keep stem cells going? How can we give them more capacity? Because the stem cells don't go away. They just stop functioning as well as they once did. But it's very tricky because the reason why our stem cells stop functioning is we don't want the most famous immortal cells in the world are cancer cells. And so we have a lot of mechanisms that are shutting things down on the cellular level, not because our cells want to kill us, but because they're protecting us against certain kinds of diseases that our body knows that we don't want. So with stem cell rejuvenation, or the pruning of senescent cells, which means that over the course of life, sometimes your cells become dormant, and it's part of the aging, the natural aging of cells, and there are good parts of that, which helps with wound healing and other things. But when you have too many senescent cells, they secrete a toxin that can be very dangerous and harmful. So there's a lot of research that's going into how can these senescent cells be pruned. And then very interestingly, when you think about the aging process, you think on one hand, intuitively, you know that you start and you're young and you get older and you just get older, and that's the aging process. And there's this very natural thing that when you think about it is kind of crazy. So how is it that you're a 30-year-old person, and how do you make an embryo, you and a partner who's maybe also your age, how do you make an embryo that is 0? Like you're 30 and your partner's 30, how is this embryo 30? How is this embryo, 0? And it's just kind of this crazy thing, but it makes you believe that we have this capacity within us to turn back the clock on ourselves because we're already doing it. I mean, it's not like if you could make fresh yogurt out of sour milk. And so, and right now, I don't know if any of you have heard of what an induced pluripotent stem cell is, but the 2012 Nobel Prize went to Shinya Yamanaka in Japan, who figured out how to take an adult cell and turn it into a stem cell. And so once they figured out how to do this, they were giving these 4 factors to mice to try to make them younger. And the first mice all died, but the later rounds of mice, they gave it to them, and all of their function became a lot better, and they were functionally equivalent to being younger mice than they were. And there's so many different ways that this is being explored. I'll just mention a few in my final minute. But one is, I spoke yesterday about the future of sex and how I believe that in the future we use IVF and embryo selection for procreation, that we as a species in general over time will stop using sex as our primary mechanism for procreation, but we'll use to what we now call assisted reproduction, but what in the future we will just call reproduction. And because we are learning what the genetic fingerprint of aging and of living a long time looks like, one of the selections, among the many selections we will be able to make, is for children who will live longer and have a genetic foundation to be more like Jean Calment and less like these people who die younger. Beyond that, really, in many ways, the sky is the limit. We talked this morning about downloadable memory. It may be that there are finite limits to what our biology can do, but will we be able to download our memories and thoughts? And if you download your memories and thoughts into a robot that could be very active, that could move around and look good and have a life, is that robot with your brain you? I don't know the answer to that, but we just saw an image this morning of somebody who had shut-in syndrome and all they could do was blink their eye to communicate. No, everyone would say that person is them. So are both of those versions the same? And if we can live in some other form, is that us? I don't know. But what I do know is that we are, and I said this yesterday, after 4 billion years of evolving by one set of rules, we are turning an evolutionary corner. And it's easy for us to look back because the past is familiar. But where we're going, all of these rules of what we think biology is are going to be different. And in dealing with this very changed world, we're going to need to really draw on the best of our ancient traditions, because there are no easy answers, but the answer is it has to be us. We have to think about what are the ethics, what are the values, what does it mean to be a human being when our traditional concepts of what a human being is are being and will be challenged as never before. So thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you.